Thank you all for joining this important conversation about race in the workplace. This event was organized by the Driehaus College of Business Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I'm Alyssa Westring, a professor in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship. At DePaul, we ask the Vincentian question, what must be done? I hope that today's conversation sparks an ongoing dialogue about how we can advance racial justice at DePaul and create future leaders who do so beyond graduation. It's my pleasure to introduce today's panelists and moderator. Shanis Windland is the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at VMware. Her background is in finance, most recently as the CFO of a startup, Heptio, that was acquired by VMware in December 2018. She has been working in fast-growing technology companies for almost 20 years and is dedicated to creating opportunity for women and underrepresented groups in technology. Eric W. Fulbright is the Director of Inclusive Cultures at Best Buy. He is a 23-year veteran of the organization and has spent the last 14 years as a leader in human resources. Eric has helped Best Buy define inclusive leadership and become one of the best companies to work for. In addition to his day job, Eric is an ordained elder, longtime youth ministry leader, coach, and father of 5. David Romero, a Chicago native and U.S. Army veteran, is a human resources leader with a primary focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as talent and organizational effectiveness. David received his Master's of Human Resource Management from DePaul in 2018. He is currently the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Wipfli LLP, a top 20 accounting and professional services firm. David has previously held roles at Accenture, KPMG, W.W. Grainger, and United Airlines. Our moderator, Dr. Stephanie Shipp, is a 30-plus year technology practitioner and tenured executive. She is currently the Director of Global Business Solutions at Dell Technologies Services, where she focuses on areas of operational execution, business improvement, talent development, and diversity and inclusion. Stephanie is also a graduate of DePaul's Doctorate in Business Administration program. She is a sought-after public speaker, panelist, moderator, and lecturer on such topics as allyship, diversity and inclusion, and employee resource groups. Thank you to our panelists and moderator for being here today. I hope the audience enjoys this conversation.
I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Tom, for opening us up today. So today is the first day after a very historic event yesterday, the inauguration of a Black and Southeast Asian woman. It seems like a great day for a conversation about race. So as we venture into this conversation, I want to take a moment to further set the stage about the discussion we're about to have. I'm excited to have this chat with our panelists. We're going to venture into this conversation. We're going to go beyond the place that maybe you've heard before when there have been D&I conversations. We're going to go a bit deeper. And with that said, I want to kick us off by asking each one of our panelists to just, you each have an amazing background. We just went through your introductions. You've demonstrated your professional competency in so many areas. You've got great acumen. But I think everybody would be interested in knowing what started your journey into DEI, and also tell us just a little bit of a snippet more about what you do today. So I'm going to ask Shanis to kick us off, and then we'll go to David and then to Eric.
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie. So happy to be here today. Appreciate you having me. So I have a bit of a non-traditional background working in DEI, where I was previously the CFO of a startup. And when I went to that startup, I actually was the 4th employee. And one of the reasons I really wanted to go to an early stage startup was to think about building culture and building DEI into the fabric of the business from the very beginning. And I was able to kind of do that from my CFO seat from the beginning. And then when I came to a large company and this opportunity to take the role with my business lens, again, thinking about building DEI into the business, not having it as a bolt-on, is really where my focus is and how I kind of got into this role as a full-time thing.
Perfect.
I'd say my role is really just driving the global DEI strategy and programs at VMware really broad. We've got 34,000 employees across the globe. And so I'm just thinking about how business leaders, again, are driving that day to day within their teams.
Thank you, Shanis. David, tell us a little bit about how you got into this space and what you're currently working on today.
Yeah, happy to. So for me, my background in DEI actually started when I was in the military, of all places. And I was stationed in a country overseas where I was doing peacekeeping, charged with a small team, and we were given a particular geographic area in this country. We're in charge of multiple towns and villages, and we had to keep a safe and secure environment. But in this country, they had recently, within the last few years, finished a civil war, and there were everything from acts of genocide to just horrible things that occurred. And so you really had a fractured populace where based on ethnic groups that just didn't get along and had a long memory of kind of injustices committed against each other. And so the job I had was how to distribute aid and kind of build a working kind of help partner to build a working government in this part of the country. And I had to essentially build what would be called a diversity council, in corporate terms, with amongst these groups who didn't want to work together, but I had to make them understand, hey, we can't disperse aid to you and help you rebuild your country or get you the resources that you need unless you guys work together. You don't have to agree or get along, but you have to work together to kind of benefit the group. And so that's what really sparked my interest within diversity, equity, inclusion when I left the military.
Can you give us a snippet of what you do today?
Yeah, so I recently joined Wipfli LLP after leaving United Airlines a few months ago, and I'm the first person in the director role for an office of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm really building out and leading all of our diversity efforts across the company.
Okay, great. Eric, tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. I really thought about this question across my life, not just about profession. And I think about, even growing up, I had the opportunity to live in very homogenous, both in communities that were very Black and brown and communities that were very white, and I was the only one. And I lived in very diverse communities. So because I had the opportunity to experience those various spectrums over the course of growing up, I grew an appreciation for diversity. I felt like the friendships were richer. I felt like the experiences were richer. Though I had appreciation for all of the experience, I realized what happens when you bring groups of people together and what we benefited as a society from that. And so as I continued through my schooling and even as I started to work professionally, I sort of pined for it. And even in my personal life, when we were looking for a place for worship or a place for our kids to go to school, we were looking for places where they could have diverse experiences. And so as a practitioner, I actually didn't start off in diversity inclusion. I actually started off studying medicine, of all things. I actually have two siblings I helped through school that are DePaul graduates. Wasn't where I ended up going, but I'm definitely a close family member. And I just ended up taking a different path. I was on the retail and operations side of Best Buy while I was going to school. And I really fell in love with the aspirational culture of the organization. And I think as we've gone through various transformations, particularly the last one where there's a lot of commentary about the comeback that Best Buy made, our prior CEO talked a lot about being a purpose-driven organization. And as we really began to embrace that and build plans behind what does that really mean for us, inclusion and diversity not only became important, it became a priority for the organization. And so because I had been involved all along, I was asked as we built out the strategy, was I willing to join the team and help build out the strategy? And so for the last 3 years, I've been deeply involved in helping us develop and expand that strategy across the organization, and just really excited to be a part of the work, not just for my organization, but to be able to give in situations like this as well.
Well, thank you all for sharing that. I think for our audience today, it's important to understand that DEI, you can work in that space and you from any number of different backgrounds from a career perspective. It's not about where you start. It's about the work that you do and where you land up. And as a matter of fact, you actually don't have to be in the DEI organization because we all own this. It's about each one of us. And we'll talk more about that. So, as I think about our next question and the fact that diversity covers several dimensions, including identity. But one of the things today we're here to talk about race. And we all know what 2020 was like. I'm not really sure where you had to be in the world to not experience or somehow see the escalating racial unrest that took place in the US, and a number of factors that have made race a more prevalent topic. And I know now that we've been having conversations in the workplace, but they are evolving. And we're including training, and we're talking about anti-racism and unconscious bias. But I want to dive into, how are you approaching the topic of race at work? And how are you coaching others? And I'd like to direct this question to both David and Shanis. Again, how are you approaching the topic of race at work? And how are you coaching others to have conversations around race at work? Because it's really something that we need to talk to each other about, how to be comfortable being uncomfortable in this topic. So David, kick us off with this, and then we'll go to Shanis.
Yeah, no, happy to. So I think, honestly, I think conversations, we're in a highly charged environment in the country, and I think we'll all agree on that. And people bring that to work, right? Where people have different strong perspectives on different things or feelings that they're bringing it to work. And the topic of race in any conversation can kind of be delicate. Because how people people's understanding of race itself is in some ways, there's different perspectives on that. Every organization is in a different place in terms of the maturity when having these types of conversations. So I think that needs to be relevant when you're having these conversations. How I approach it is definitely making sure that whoever is having that conversation, or however we're doing it, it's moderated, it's structured, because there's so many different opinions out there that we want to approach these topics and introduce them in a way where everyone's going to understand, everyone's going to kind of get the feeling where we're allowing people to have different perspectives and opinions and explore these conversations. But at the same time, they're delicate conversations. So making sure that there's the maturity involved to have these conversations is kind of how I would start off, based on the maturity level, and just really focusing there initially.
Okay, great. Shanis?
Yeah, so I think there's still folks who say they're really uncomfortable with this topic. It's like politics. You don't bring it to work. But we've got to just move past that as organizations. So I think we're really trying to hit it, straight on. As an example, we've been using guest speakers. I think moderated discussions, structured discussions, as David said, are important. One person we brought in was Ijeoma Olua. She wrote a book about how to talk about race. So we had her come to talk to our company so our employees could hear that perspective from her. We had our executives read that book. And I think it does take practice. So, we use the right names for groups, and we try not to group people together and assume everyone in a community is the same thing. And we talk about that openly and directly. And last year, following George Floyd's murder and the protests around Black Lives Matter, we created a toolkit for our managers to go to employees in their organization and actually say, how are you doing? How can I support you? And I think the more we just make it a topic of conversation that's really open, and we practice talking about it, then we can get over that uncomfortable nature of it. That doesn't mean it isn't hard, but I think it just does take direct hit on the head. We got to talk about it.
I totally agree. All too often, we have heard, I'm sure each one of us on the panel and those who are joining us today have heard the conversation or comment that I don't see color. I don't see color. I don't even think about it. And the reality is we should see color. I would liken it to walking through a garden where you see different flowers of different colors and different shapes. By looking at those flowers and seeing those colors, you can embrace the beauty and the value of what they bring to that garden. I would say likewise with employees and people that you work with. By seeing them, you see the beauty and the value that they bring to the table. But I also recognize that sometimes those conversations can be challenging. And as David said, they can be very sensitive. So can you all, I want to direct this to Eric and David this time. And if you would share with us possibly an experience where discussing race may have been delicate or detrimental, and how you can overcome those challenges, because they do happen. You know, people start out with the best of intentions and things go awry. So if you could share with us, Eric, let's kick it off with you.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think for the practitioners, particularly the HR professionals and DI, and I would say the leaders as well, the practice that my colleagues spoke of is really important, because practice leads to comfortability and competence, which really helps you in the space. The other thing I think is really important that you have to, when you're setting up these conversations and you're engaging with your constituents, is to be really clear that we need to create an environment of grace and psychological safety. People need to understand that sometimes the way someone articulates a question or the particular term they use may not be the best suited one, but they have good intent. Because if we don't create an environment where people feel like they can fall and get back up, they're going to be reluctant to engage and they won't learn. And this is really about creating an environment where people are learning. And the reason why I say that's really important as we think about, situations like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Christopher Brooks and, Jacobs and all those different, really, hard to visually remember scenarios. When our allies, particularly people who don't identify that same way, are able to engage and then lead some of those conversations, it actually takes away some of the burden from those that are actually experiencing trauma themselves. But if you haven't created an environment of grace, there's not an ability for them to lean in. And so the reason I say that is that has to come from both sides. The grace to be able to hear the pain and hurt that people are experiencing, and the grace to understand that people are on their own empathy journey to understand what that experience is, and the ability to help people get there. One of the things I share in these conversations is just a simple change curve. When you help people understand that, if it's a difficult change, the amount of time you're going to spend with them on the journey needs to be longer. And so you can't expect them to get to the space that you might be at in that moment based on the degree and difficulty of that change. And sometimes we don't apply the same business practices in some of these very tense, hard to deal with moments like we would in some other scenarios. And so I really try to get leaders to slow down and apply some of the great principles we learn in business colleges and other places in these situations as well, when we're dealing about topics as tough as race.
Thank you for that. David, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. I'd say when I'm having these kind of conversations, I like to focus on perspectives. There's people out there that they can relate to certain things that are going on in the world. They can relate strongly. They've experienced it. It resonates with them strongly. Then there's other people that in their day-to-day life or their perspective or their experience, it just doesn't resonate with them. So it's about how do you get them to show that empathy, like Eric mentioned, and kind of understand that perspective. They don't necessarily have to agree with that perspective. And what we're seeing in today's environment is in many cases, people have just a wide spectrum of experiences and opinions. But trying to get them to understand, why are people feeling this emotion? What are they going through? Why is this significant? And again, they don't have to agree with them, but we want them to understand that, because these are the people that they're working with at work. And we want people to understand why people are feeling this way. And regardless of how they feel, we want people to have respect at work and respect what people are going through, what their colleagues are going through, what their employees are going through, and help it resonate with them if it does. I'd say where I've kind of seen challenges is when you have these kinds of conversations, you're in a business environment or a corporate environment, you're going to get people who are going to say certain things. So when you're opening up the conversation, you might you're gonna have some terms used, some words used, or people that just don't know any better that might say certain things. And in some cases, it can create conflict, right? Where a team might walk away and say, "Oh my God, I had no idea you felt that way." And emotions are being let out. People are saying different things. I think it's about making sure you're creating that environment where you're having these conversations, but they fit within your values in terms of what people are saying and expressing. Because what you don't want to happen is you don't want people to say something that doesn't meet your values, because then it turns into a different kind of issue, right? Once it comes out of their mouth.
And I think if I can capture what you've all said, it's really about creating a safe space, providing grace for people who are at a different place in their learning curve as they evolve, giving them grace so they can evolve and learn, but also in that journey of allowing them the grace, also making certain that there's respect and regard for those folks in the room. And one of the things I want to go back to from the previous question is making certain that you're having structured conversations and you're empowering the people who are either leading those, particularly those people who are leading those discussions, empowering them with the right information and the right resources and the right support as they venture into those conversations. I will
Absolutely.
tell you, and you all know
Dr. Shipp, can I add one more quick comment?
I see you lighting up. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, you reminded me of something, as I thought back of, something that was happening in our system. As we begin to see these moments of social unrest and the noise level went up around taking action, we actually had a group of employees that felt like they were left out of the conversation and that they were being misrepresented to a large degree. And it was actually the employees that identified as conservative. And you think about how people are typically labeled or identified by the media or the places, they were actually afraid to share their perspectives and point of views in many of the audiences because of where I call it the zeitgeist or the spirit of the age was going. They felt like they were outside of it. And so we actually formed a group or allowed a group of employees to form where they can come together and have conversations around what they were experiencing, what their beliefs were. We had leaders come in and listen. We had our other ERGs begin to listen to what their experiences are, and it allowed an opportunity to begin to bridge across that difference. Are there still strong fundamental differences between how they're thinking and what's happening in other groups? Absolutely. What it did is, to your point, it created a sense of safety and equity where we really were living by our values as an organization to listen and to take action and to ensure that we were creating experiences where all employees felt like they can truly belong and make a difference within the organization.
And I think that's a great point in terms of making certain you make safe space for listening for all employees. Because while we may perceive or assume that someone's not being affected by race because they may not be of a particular or may not identify as a particular race, is not necessarily factual and true. And so it's important that in the spirit of inclusivity, that we consider and make space for everyone's voice to be heard and their input to be considered. I will tell you, at my own company, we did do listening sessions. And one of the things that I would encourage anyone who is a practitioner or thinking about it that may not have done so, Shanis mentioned that at her company, they have toolkits. There's nothing like creating a toolkit, to help someone, guide them along the way. It's like giving somebody a map so that they have some help as they travel on this journey, because everybody is not at the same place. I want to move us along a little bit more in the discussion. We actually have a question that came in from an attendee or a participant, and I'm going to slightly reframe it, but I think this is a great place to insert it. So, and it goes something like this. The participant has read information which suggests the focus on race is ill-placed at this moment in time. And it's an attempt by people of non-color to control the narrative and show some level of supremacy. Any one of you want to take a stab at that? If not, I have thoughts.
I'm not quite sure I understand the framing of the question, Stephanie. So you jump in and then maybe I can add to that.
I think that the essence of it is that we have a participant who's been doing some reading that feels like that now is not the right time to have conversations around race, and that someone is trying to control the narrative by having conversations around race. But I would tell you, and there's a quote that goes something like this: if not now, when? And if not me, who? And so if now's not the right time to have these conversations, given the way that we've seen things evolve over the last, year, not to mention anything that was prior to that existed in our country and in our culture. If now is not the time to have these conversations without regard for who's hosting or leading them, if now's not the time, when it's going to be the right time. And so I would submit to our participants that now is absolutely the right time to have the conversation. We have a burning platform that gives us license to start the discussion and make it a safe place, as you all have discussed, and frame it to move us to a better future in all of our companies and even in our communities.
Yeah, Stephanie, I would add to your commentary. If you think about it, this isn't the first time where this topic has reached the level or the volume it has in our country. There's been other significant moments throughout history where the volume has been this high. And it's usually because of what's happening within those particular communities. And so if the conversation isn't happening, usually the action that needs to happen to address what people are experiencing also doesn't follow. And I've seen there's been times where whether that voice has been suppressed or there's been a level of comfort that things have gotten good enough that the voice doesn't need to remain at the same volume. And what you typically experience is the progress stops or it goes backwards. And so there's a lot that needs to happen around addressing inequity within the country, to fix systemic issues that disadvantage some versus others. And that's not going to happen unless we are willing to have an honest conversation as a country about what's happening to all of us, because it does affect all of us. The fact that we don't have the workforce that we need to fuel the economy that we have, even though it's been stunted by the pandemic to a large degree, should alarm us. Even though we have the able bodies available, we have to invest in everyone in order for us to have the type of economy and growth and experience that our Constitution and those who fought for equal rights all along the way actually promises to an American citizen. And so I think you have to have the conversation in order for the actions to come behind it to make the dreams that we all have come true.
I love that, Eric. And I've been thinking about this in the context of, this is framed within corporate America. The topic of DEI is, kind of everywhere at the moment. The conversations are heightened, and I worry about fatigue around the topic. Okay, we did that last year. Do we still have to do it this year? Do we still have to do it next year? And in fact, it's urgent, important. We have to keep the pressure on. We have to keep the conversation going. We have to continue to talk about it because it's going to take time to make progress. And there's a lot of, progress that needs to be made. So we have to keep that conversation. I love the way you framed it, like loud and the pressure on, so that we can continue to move things forward.
Yeah, and I agree with what both people said. I think looking back when Barack Obama became president, I think a lot of people, companies started saying, hey, do we really need BRGs at our company? And there was that trend going on of where, hey, we had reached something where, we have a Black president and we're in a good place and maybe race isn't an issue in this country. But I think just being honest, and I think whatever, whether you're, however you vote, whether you're liberal, conservative, somewhere in the middle, I think we'd all agree race is still an issue. There are issues that affect people based on their race. Not saying everyone in a race, right? Because there's social and economic issues that factor into that, right? But there's issues that affect people based on race. And if you could see, a Black man murdered on, on video, and I think an example like that, where it brought it into the living rooms, onto the cell phones of millions of people across the country, where they didn't experience something like that. They didn't resonate with them before, and they didn't think it was an issue anymore. But then seeing something like that has really just kind of made a lot of people think again, and really opened up the ability to have these types of conversations.
I think we had a epidemic on top of another epidemic in terms of, we had folks who were at home on pause, nowhere to go, could clearly see what was being presented on the news. And now we have the layering of the social media effect, where anything that happens anywhere can be seen within a moment's time. And that has escalated the experiences that we historically have had, because now it just brings it right into your home. And now you've had a captive audience, so to speak. All the points you've raised have been very poignant. And we actually have a question in the window that piggybacks off of this. And it's a question for any one of the leaders. And I'll just ask one of you, if you would, you can draw straws. But the question is around, how do you support your leaders that are being affected by implicit bias that they're either getting from their colleagues or individuals working under their leadership? So any recommendations for support for leaders who are experiencing implicit bias from their colleagues or individuals who work under their leadership? Eric, I see you.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of things that you can do. One of the things that we did a couple years ago, and we still do to a pretty good degree, is to provide reverse mentors for leaders, where we actually have senior leaders partner with more junior associates from various perspectives of life that don't align to theirs. And so that could be based on race, it could be based on orientation, economic backgrounds. There's a lot of different ways you can do that, which actually gives them the opportunity to build empathy and learn. Another thing that we do is we provide, in a non-pandemic environment, physical cultural immersions, where we take people outside their normal environment, we take them into a place that's different, where they're learning, experiencing something that's outside of their norm, that aligns with the needs that they might have. Sometimes that's driven by some sort of cultural competency assessment we'll do with the leadership team to better understand where they're at in their journey. And I'll tell you, you've heard it a lot today. There's a lot of power in just having a conversation and really seeking to understand with a leader. I mean, far too often there's an assumption that a leader who, exudes confidence and is, an expert or excellent at what they do in their day job, is comfortable with this topic as well. And I've found that they're extremely appreciative when you take the time to slow down, recognize a behavior that may not be beneficial or a learning opportunity you see with them, and be willing to help them along in a journey or connect them with someone who can. And I've yet to find someone not want to engage at that level. And I've seen whole teams transformed because the leader was transformed, and they took their team on a journey because they were going on a journey.
And that really takes us to our next topic, which intersects with race, which is about inclusion. And that's really what you've been talking about. We've all been talking about different ways to bring people on the journey to being a more inclusive workplace. And there are definitions about what inclusion is. And so for our audience, I just want to make certain that we level set in terms of when we say inclusion, we're talking about achieving a work environment in which all individuals, not some, but all, are treated fairly, respectfully. And I'm going to use the word regard in place of respect, because everybody has different definitions for respect, but also have equal access to opportunity and resources, and can contribute to an organization fully, contribute to the organization's success. And with that definition of inclusion in mind, I'd like to ask you to give some examples of steps that you've taken to create a more inclusive workspace. Shanis, kick us off with this one.
Yeah, so I love that definition because one of the most important things about, well, the couple things that you said, one is it's for all. So we have to think about language when we think about that too, and ensure that we aren't creating spaces where we're blaming certain groups or certain individuals for action. So regard. And then I also think fully contributing to the organization, for me, this is the most powerful connection to the bottom line of an organization. When everyone's included and they belong and they give their best work to the company, the outcome is greater than, the sum of the parts, right? And so I just think that's super powerful. But one of the things that we learned is that we were going around to our leaders saying, be more inclusive. And they didn't actually really understand what that meant. I don't think this is necessarily taught as traditional management, or not everyone grew up with this terminology. And so we kind of took a step back and said, we wanted to design a course, and actually in combination with Dell Technologists. So it's a really cool course. We call it Inclusive Leadership in Action. And it's really about defining inclusive leadership and giving examples of it and how you can live that kind of day to day. And that's been a really huge kind of game changer for us when people have those aha moments and they see dynamics they're creating that they didn't realize they were in the past, and ways they can go back to their teams and just act differently. So it's been really great for us.
Okay. I actually David, do you want to jump in and add something to that? And I also have a question, I think, that dovetails. So I'll ask you to go ahead and respond, and then I'll grab one of these questions from our participants.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just, when I think about inclusion, I think about it's on different levels as well, right? Physical space of your work environment, right? Where, for example, something so simple as making sure in your break room, you have a microwave where someone who maybe has a disability, they're in a wheelchair, they can reach it to heat up their lunch. It's something as basic as that, where it creates a whole different experience for an employee. Or it could be on your website, making sure that, you might have people that are colorblind or have some other kind of visual impairment, and making sure that your websites and, from a technology perspective, it's inclusive to allow people to function or people to learn or take part. So I think about making sure you're thinking about all those different types of aspects and dimension of inclusive is important as well.
I totally agree with you. And I would also add, in the context of race, notice who's in the room, be it your physical room or your virtual room, and notice who's not getting an opportunity to finish their statement. Notice who's not being included in some way for their input, and make space. If you're the person who gets the opportunity to talk, notice and make space for that person. Look to your left or your right and say, I notice Stephanie has been trying to jump in here and share something with us. Stephanie, can you tell us what it was you wanted to share? That's one way of being inclusive, to take notice of that. As a Black female in the tech space, oftentimes I'm the only person in the room. I'm the only one in the room. And so I dearly appreciate in those instances where my colleagues have been inclusive and made space for me and been an ally, which actually aligns to one of the questions. One of the questions is really about how can a white male be an ally to people of color without, and I think that's the crux of the question. If someone would take on that question, just give some pointers around how to be an ally. And the one thing I would say before anyone kicks off is, ally is not a title. It is not a noun, it is a verb. So it requires action. And so with that being said, I'll pass the baton to one of our panelists.
Yeah, I appreciate your definition. I usually take people back to times of war. Like, the allies are the people that came and fought beside you and worked with you to overcome usually very large obstacles that you couldn't overcome by yourself. And so it's a big task. And so for the person who's asking that question, I just want to honor you for the intention behind your action. And I think one of the first things you have to do is to self-educate a bit. Often you'll hear about the burden to educate others to come and help, which I think you never really have the ability to fully unload that. And I share that with those that I work with all the time. However, I have found that allies that are most effective are the ones that go on a journey themselves with the support of others to really learn about what's happening with the groups that they're really trying to support, particularly those around race, but it can also be from the LGBTQI plus community, and you can go down the D&I list for that. But I would tell you, if after you go on a journey around understanding and educating, is to be genuinely curious and to begin to spend time in the environment where the people that you're trying to support actually live, socialize, and interact. And you have to spend time with people to understand them. And so this isn't something that happens overnight. And as they see that you're actually wanting to get to know them as a human being, people actually appreciate the support. It doesn't feel like, oh, you're just riding the wave and you want to help because that's the thing to do right now. It's the socially conscious, responsible, cool thing to do, which there's an air of that happening, and organizations are actually getting in trouble for that when they're actually going out and making big bold statements, and employees internal to the organization going, that's not true inside. And they'll do that as well at the micro level. And so I think it's important that you're really genuinely trying to get to know people, and then that will actually give you the competence, the cultural competence, to begin to be an ally, because you'll understand, you'll have the empathy to be able to take action. The connection that you have to the human being will generate the courage to go, I'm going to do something about that. I'm going to use my professional capital on behalf of that individual or these individuals to help speak up on their cause. And so, though I said a lot, it's actually simple in nature. It just takes time and diligence to actually do the work and truly be an ally, just like you would be a friend. The difference between being an ally for a loved one, someone you've known your whole life, and someone you're getting to know, is you don't have that empathy curve when it's your sister, it's your mom, that understanding. You can snap into action because you understand. But when you're learning about a community, you actually have to do the work that you naturally were able to do with that loved one. And so that's the part that I ask people really to engage with, because when you do, that muscle memory goes into place then too. Because I have some very powerful allies within the organization that have been on that journey that understand, and when they see things that are systemically wrong, they spring into action.
I love that, Eric. And I would add, just you can do small things as you're learning. So if you're in a meeting and you see maybe there's only all white men in that meeting, what can you do to change that dynamic? Why does that exist? Ask that question. If you're on a panel, what does the panel look like? If you're at a conference, who are the attendees? Who are the speakers? There's ways you can start to just open your eyes to, what exists in the world, and then see how you might be able to make small changes. They don't have to be, in the public, they can be behind the scenes, but if you're actively working to change the dynamic and the makeup, that's allyship in action. That's taking action while you're learning about a community.
And also, we have a question around how can someone continue being outspoken about DEI without being perceived as always criticizing. It's not the what, it's the how. So I would encourage that participant. It's the framing of the comment. It's the timing of the comment. Sometimes it's more appropriate to take a counterpart peer leader to the side, and rather than accuse, do something as simple as ask the question. Maybe it's the way they phrase something, and ask, I'm not sure if you're aware that when you use this phrase, it meant X, Y, and Z. Because some people use phrases that have just, they've heard it time and time again, never understanding the genesis of it or how offensive it could be to certain populations of people. And we often use phrases that on the surface, we've gotten so numb to hearing them that we don't understand the racist genesis behind them. I'll give you the example of something being grandfathered in. The genesis of that particular phrase of something being grandfathered in was what allowed the exclusion of freed slaves to be able to vote. The rule or the law was that if a grandfather had the right to vote prior to the freedom of slavery, then the son could or the grandson could. So in the case of freed slaves, their grandfathers did not have the right to vote, and therefore they could not be grandfathered in. A term that I'm sure, if not everyone has used it, most of us have heard it at some point in time, but it has very negative roots and things that we have to purge our language of. So just little things like that. I want to keep us moving. And one of the other questions, and this has been a rich dialogue for me, even someone who lives in this space to a certain degree most of my day. I'm always excited to hear and learn other things that people are doing. This is one of those more, this is one of those deeper questions. Our leaders and executive roles, those are the places where decisions are made in companies. Those are where the changes happen. But the data clearly indicates that there's still a ceiling for Black, Indigenous, people of color in these roles. Well, I'd love to hear from you all about what actions do you recommend companies and organizations can take to influence and drive change there, to change the representation. And just as importantly, back into the point about allies, what can allies do as well? If they're not the direct hiring leader, what can they do along that journey to help drive change? I want to start with David.
Yeah, I'd say what I like to focus on when I'm working for a company on affecting change with representation at top or anywhere in leadership is really taking a look at our processes and starting there to figure out what are our processes and what does the data show, and why we look this way. Do we have a fair process in terms of promotion process, and do we have a diverse candidate slate? If we don't, how do we build one? Do we have resources? Are people being left out? And, are there any kind of red flags in a particular area? That's what I really like to focus on, that process perspective, and making sure that we're building that equity, that fair equity within the system. And then influencing others to kind of see where that process is going. And from just like, if anyone who's thinking from, especially for a lot of business leaders, they think about these processes every day, but approaching it from a diversity perspective and saying, this is what the data shows, this is what is occurring in this type of process. If we continue to do things this way, it's going to result in this. Can we change this process? Or can we provide more transparency? Or can we take additional steps? For me, it's an important step because I think it really resonates for a lot of business leaders. And they're forced to kind of come to terms with any gaps that they might have in any of their processes that are leading to underrepresentation in some cases.
Eric, I know this was something that you also wanted to raise something about. So if you'd share.
Yeah, I think that in this particular question, what's most important is that you have the buy-in from senior leadership specifically. And I mean, the highest ranking leaders in your organization, the CEO, the board, are very important partners in this work, because if there's not belief there, it's not going to become important throughout the rest of the organization. What you'll often end up with is this fire at the grassroots that it really wants to move, but they don't have the resources and the infrastructure to make it happen because the leadership team really isn't bought in. And so I think it's important that the CEO, the board are really bought in. We've spent a lot of time there. We actually have a subcommittee within our board of directors that's focused on inclusion, diversity. We have a council set up that is specifically the senior leadership team. So it's the CEO, her directs, and then the COO and his directs that are part of this inclusion and diversity council. And so when we're having a conversation around inclusion, diversity, and the actions that need to happen after that, the conversations are actually happening with the people that are running the organization. And so you actually have the benefit of the push that's coming from the leadership team and then also the groundswell that's happening in our employee population that's saying we want to see change, which is the right approach. Because you'll often hear this conversation, well, what's not happening in the middle? Well, if you have it coming from the top and you have it coming from the bottom, the middle really begins to hear. And I call it the critical middle. You'll hear people use terms like frozen tundra. No, actually, that's the part you want to get moving, because that's when the organization starts to really make progress. And then the last piece I'll just add around this topic around like what do you have to do is you gotta make sure that leaders are making it real in their actions and decision to make. So when you look at your board, if the board has a committee, is the board makeup actually diverse? There was a lot of focus there. Is there focus around the diversification of that senior leadership team? And do you actually have goals in place that actually begin to diversify the top rankings of your organization, where you'll often find the least diversity actually exists?
I would also add, in addition to that, what are your leaders doing to sponsor that critical middle? Are they, people understand the term mentorship, someone who can mentor you, help you grow your skills, your capabilities, very similar to a coach, but different from an ally. Sponsorship is what makes the difference between someone getting a new role and getting promoted or not. So are your executives not only supporting your DEI programs, but are they actively sponsoring top talent, diverse talent? How are they engaging with them as well? So that would be the one thing I would add there. It's very critical. Are they putting in the work themselves through who they're sponsoring? Okay, well, I want to keep us moving, and man, we've got 5 more minutes. Oh my goodness, this has been like, we talked about how fast this would go, and I'm going to get to. So for the folks out there, there's one question I really want to get to, because as a DEI practitioner, we all have our wish list. There are things that we wish that we could do. And so I'm going to pose to each one of our panelists, if you had a magic DEI wand, and you could address one element of DEI, what would it be and why? I'm going to start with Shanis, and then we'll just keep going from there.
Okay, this is a tough because I only get one, but my view is that a lot of really what drives diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations comes down to day-to-day decisions that are made by kind of managers, leaders, coworkers, which really just drives the experience of employees at a company. And if I could just change one thing, I would kind of fast forward through this education piece. I would make sure that people, kind of everywhere fundamentally understood systemic racism, ableism, sexism, et cetera, and came to the workplace with empathy. And if we could all just get to that point, I believe we would be driving diversity, equity, and inclusion so much faster and so much broader across our organizations. So that's my answer.
Thank you for that one. Actually, I'm just going to go to David, and then I'm going to close us out just so I can be considerate of our audience time.
Yeah, I would just say in a very divisive America, just what I would ask is, people just keep an open mind, be curious, try to understand and be open to different perspectives, even if you might feel very strongly about something, because that's what's really going to allow people to kind of understand perspectives and make those changes and allow everybody to be included.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to share 2 closing quotes, and then I'm going to pass the baton back over to Alessa. The first quote is a quote from Martin Luther King that I'm not sure that people hear quite as frequently as some of the others. The ultimate measure of a man or a woman is not where he stands in the moment of comfort and convenience, but where they stand in times of challenge and controversy. These are challenging and controversial times. I would encourage each of us to take inventory of where we're standing. And the second quote comes from Angela Davis. I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I can know that I cannot accept. So for each of you, decide those things that maybe you're no longer going to accept them, and make a decision to start changing them. With that, thank you again for joining us, and I pass it back over to Alessa.
Thank you all, and to our panelists and our wonderful moderator. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to assure the people who are here that if you didn't have a chance to get your questions answered, especially those that are directly related to things that we're doing at DePaul, we hear you. I've saved all those questions that were asked today, and I will bring them back to our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And if you would like to send additional feedback, you can do so to me. I'm A Westrin, no G on the end, at DePaul.edu. Or you could also email Sandra Shelton, who's the chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, sshelton@DePaul.edu. And we will take time to reflect, think, answer, and act. Thank you all for being here, and all the best to you in this very historic and optimistic week.